A Life of Smoke and Silvered Glass, a Harry Potter fanfiction written by E.Jade Lomax on Archive of Our Own as Dirge Without Music. Part 1 of 6. Read by Grant Goodwin. What if Snape hadn't called Lily Mudblood that day? What if their friendship had stayed strong, unbreakable? Would he have grown to be a better person? Would Lily have loved him rather than James? Would Harry have just another godfather? Would James and Lily have survived? When Severus was 7, he fell in love with a girl down the street. She had long red hair and dirty knees, and she offered him half her candy bar one drizzly afternoon, waiting outside the school for her parents to come pick her up. His parents weren't coming. Dad working late, and Mum at the pub, recounting old Hogwarts glory stories, talking of years when her life was magical. But he didn't tell Lily that. He was just waiting for the older bully boys who lurked in the empty lot on his way home to get bored and leave. He ate the candy slowly in neat little bites, while she grinned and told him about her big sister's feud with the science teacher, like her Toonie was some sort of hero in a political espionage drama. She talked with her hands, narrow little things with freckled backs. He watched her wave from the back window of her mother's car, and then he started the long walk home. When Severus was 15, James Potter dangled him upside down on the quad and laughed. Severus landed on elbows and knees. The bruises would stay for a week. The memories would not die with them. James's cocky grin, the laughter in the spring air, the long whip of Lily's red hair. He felt small, bug-like, his knees pressing into the grass. His mother would come home some nights, kick the threadbare carpet, rattle the battered old pans in the cupboard, curse a ministry that hated purebloods, that sucked up to half-breeds and mudbloods, that left the true wizards to rot in filth. He would curl up, make himself small, bug-like, imagine a chitinous shield growing over his shoulders, his spine, the softness of his kidneys. Some days his father slept through this. Some days he screamed back. After Severus met Lily, he would curl up under his covers, small, bug-like, and read through the comics she'd lent him with his hands pressed up over his ears. He wanted Professor X to come take him away. He wanted to be someone special, someone saved. He wanted a giant to burst through his door and frighten his mother, and offer him a squashed birthday cake and a way out. When Severus was 15, he slammed to his knees on the green Hogwarts quad. Laughter burrowed into his ears, like curses, like the nights his father screamed back. And when Lily stepped toward him, he snapped, "I don't need help from a mudblood." When Severus slouched up to her door that summer, Lily didn't invite him in. She leaned on the open frame of the door, arms crossed. He had so rarely seen Lily neither smiling or incandescent with rage, but she watched him with snakeskin eyes and a set mouth, still. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't." She twitched a strand of her hair over her shoulder, the irritation the closest thing to an emotion he could spot on her. He was watching, desperate. This was Lily. She gave things away. She talked with her hands. He never felt lost with her. "But why?" said Lily. "Why are you sorry? Because I'm upset? Or because what you did was wrong?" "I didn't mean to hurt you." "You did, and it's not the point. I don't care if it's the part you care about, Sev. It's not the part that matters. That was an awful thing to say to anyone. You were cruel because you were scared and embarrassed. But, Sev, I could really care less. You were cruel." "I'm sorry," he said again. "Sorry's not enough, Sev. Be fucking better." He jerked back and tried to turn it into some kind of laugh. "Language, careful, your mum might hear." She shrugged and stepped back through the open door and shut it in his face. He spent the summer reading comic books, haunting the local library, then the local park once it had closed, and then sneaking home when he was hopeful his parents would be asleep. He tried to think about bravery, but sometimes he just thought about Lily's hair, the way it went more golden in summer. He tried to think about nobility, ethics and grace, but the clouds chased each other, fat and white across the sky, and he wasn't sure what any of this had to do with him. His father took him fishing by a dreary brown creek, and they sat in silence. Severus could hear every creak of the rods, every lap of the water, every inhale and movement his father made. He thought maybe if he just said nothing, nothing ever, he'd never say anything again that made Lily's face go so flat and distant. If he said nothing, maybe nothing would hurt. His father reached back for a beer can in a swift movement, and Severus froze himself unflinching. He sat in that silence afterwards, slowing his heartbeat, picking apart the sudden rigid shell of his shoulders. His father hummed, cracking the can open like a gunshot. He sat alone on the Hogwarts Express that year, stuffed in a compartment with a handful of second-years, who gave him half the seats while they giggled among themselves about the haircut of someone named Gertrude. Every summer's end, for 5 years, he and Lily had boarded the train together, pressed their noses to the window glass, and watched the land rush by. For the first month of school, Severus practiced pausing before he spoke, for seconds, minutes if he needed them. Sometimes he'd add an answer after the conversation had already moved on, bent over his mashed potatoes, weighing words as carefully as he weighed salamander eyes and mandrake root. If you crushed firedrake seeds with the flat of your blade, instead of cutting them, they made a more potent potion. The textbooks told you to stir 6 times counterclockwise to make sleeping draught, but he knew, because he had thought, and tried again, that if you did 5 counterclockwise and 2 clockwise, the draught would turn that perfect turquoise, and the sleep would be dreamless and sweet and deep. He kept notes in his textbook's margins, because it helped to remember. In the second month he tried to listen. People were starting to think about life after school, a big yawning chasm they were supposed to fill with themselves. People were starting to fall in love, puppyish and petty. People were starting to believe in the war, whispering, dreaming, fearing. In the common room, one of the kids said something about mudbloods, and Severus's head snapped up. He tried to imagine a shell growing into his shoulders, over his spine, covering all the soft parts of him. He wanted his covers, he wanted to shrink, he wanted Lily's boxfuls of comics, but he rose to his feet and snapped back. Sometimes saying nothing hurt people too. A small muggle-born in green and silver ducked away to her dorm, clutching quietly at her sleeves. For the 3rd month he tried to watch, not for warning sneers or cocky grins, clenched fists and broad shoulders, all the things he'd been watching for since before he could name them, but for the way shoulders might go rigid, the way fists might clench but hide, wishing for something to shield every soft part of them. Severus was bony and pimply, 16 years old and graceless in it, but he could be an interruption. He could mock with the best of them, flicking his brows and twisting his nose, and asking pointed questions. He could talk, smart-mouthed and snide, until the focus turned to him, and then he could survive anything they handed out. He could give as good as he got. The pauses were shorter these days, before he spoke, but they would always be there, an echo offset from the shout, an avalanche that struck late and terrible. When kids cried in bathrooms or empty classrooms or the library, he didn't move to comfort them, though he heard them. He didn't know how. He wrote his own curses, out in the forest where he could scar the trees and experiment, and they all turned out bloody. He loved few things, even Lily, as much as he loved pouring all of himself into his work, until something new in his own grew out of it. He wasn't sure he'd ever invented something kind. He didn't try to find Lily, but he came back from the forest once and almost tripped over her, half napping in Hagrid's pumpkin patch. He stumbled back into a gargantuan gourd while she pushed her hair out of her face and peered up at him. "I'm sorry," he said after a pause that rumbled and roiled in his gut, that he clung to with both hands, breathing into it and letting his shoulders go soft. "I'm sorry I said it. I'm sorry I made you feel small because I was feeling small." Lily sat up a bit, in the little semicircle she'd built herself of books and scrolls and gobstones and snacks. She had built fairy circles like that, when they were children, of the flowers he'd transfigured for her. "I'm sorry anyone has to feel that way, ever," he said. "They shouldn't. I'm angry anyone has to feel that way." "Me too," she said, and fishing around in the detritus that surrounded her, handed him half a candy bar. "Come on, you want some tea? Hagrid said he'd put a kettle on for me if I finished my arithmancy." When Severus was in 6th year, Remus Lupin almost killed him on a moonlit night. Severus had wanted answers, had wanted to get them in trouble, had wanted something a bit like vengeance, and Sirius had told him about the Whomping Willow. Sirius had grinned when he'd done it, small and bitter, and Severus had wondered if he was fighting with James again, wondering why else he'd sell out his friends. "I didn't think," Sirius tried the morning after, watching Remus across dry toast and cocoa, big juicy balls of melon. "You never do," Remus snapped. A bare handful of years later, standing in the smouldering ruins of James and Lily's house, Remus would think about Sirius's erratic gaze, the sharp edge of his voice, his last name, and wonder if he should have seen it coming. What here was premeditated? What was mischief? Sirius had once almost painted Remus's own hands with red blood. But for now, Remus was 16 and angry. He was 16 and guilty of things that might have happened. He didn't speak to Sirius for a month. James refused to speak with Sirius too, but he only lasted a week. Mooney was sulking, and Peter was busy studying his little heart out, and James got twitchy without proper and regular socialization. "I'll punch him in the nose," said Lily, when Severus told her. She shifted where she sat, cross-legged on the library table, like she might go off and hunt him down that second. "Black doesn't deserve the attention," said Severus. "Getting his ass kicked by a girl? That type of attention?" "Getting his ass kicked by Lily Evans," Severus said. "It'd be an honor, and you know it." Reports of violence outside Hogwarts got worse. People were disappearing. People were whispering, fearing. The papers were ignoring the important things and feeding off the fear-mongering, or so Lily announced in the library while Severus was trying to study. Alice and Lily had spent years sharing hissed rants in humid greenhouses. Over an undulating bed of luminescent, deadly nightshade, Alice bent her head close to Lily's and asked, "Have you heard of the Order of the Phoenix?" It took a series of introductions, arguments, and passwords, but a few weeks later Lily trudged out to the Hog's Head to meet with a group of interested students and graduates. Severus followed behind her, crunching his boots down on top of the smaller footprints she left behind in the snow. "Is it legal for the headmaster to recruit students to his guerrilla army?" Severus wondered aloud, shoving his freezing hands into his armpits. "Shush," said Lily. When they got into the pub, Severus tried to pretend that no one was looking at him. The only other Slytherin was Kingsley Shacklebolt, now an Auror trainee at the Ministry. Severus tugged Lily over to a pair of seats where he could sit with his back to no one. There were a few adults in the group: Professor McGonagall, who was perched stiffly on a stool, a slightly smelly man who appeared to be stashing an empty mug into his bag, and a small woman with flyaway hair who had cat dander all over her knees. Albus Dumbledore rose to his feet, smiling at them in that way of his, like he knew something you didn't, and he was proud of you for it. "Friends," he began. The door thudded open, and the marauders burst in, late and pink-cheeked with cold. The headmaster smiled at them too, and Sirius gave a cheery little salute back. Severus sunk lower in his chair, staring witheringly over his butterbeer. "You told Potter about it too?" "He might as well put all that energy to good use," said Lily. "And, to be accurate, I told Remus." "But Potter, really?" said Severus. "He and Black cooked up a jinx that gives you a boil every time you say a slur to a Muggleborn," said Lily. "It was either invite them to Alice's war club, or bake them cookies, and I know where my skills lie." Severus sniffed. "Don't come crying to me if he tugs your pigtails." "Come crying to me if he pulls yours, and I'll deck him," said Lily. At their third clandestine meeting, Dumbledore pulled Severus aside. Severus kept to the side in these meetings anyway, so Lily didn't even notice him go. Out in the cold side alley, Dumbledore put his hands in the pockets of his robes and watched Severus slowly. Severus felt weighed. After a long moment he lifted his chin and looked back. "Severus," said Dumbledore, "I'm going to ask something difficult of you. It would mean not coming to meetings anymore. It would mean a lot of things." In the decades they would fight this long, quiet war together, Severus would come to know Albus Dumbledore better than most. He would see him tired, see where his enigmas faded into exhausted despair. He would come to know that this hesitancy was something the headmaster would grow out of, one day, when asking children to give their lives for the cause. There would be no stumble to this man's voice. "I do want to be here," Severus said, quiet and trying his best not to be angry with him. "I'm not—" He took a breath, a pause, clung to it with the two hands that were trying to be patient. "I know what side I'm on." "Of course," said Dumbledore. "That's why I'm asking this of you." He glanced back through the open door to where Lily was listening intently to Alice. Words brimmed in Severus's throat, but he didn't say them. Not just for her. "It will be difficult," said Dumbledore. "It may be heartbreaking, but having a man on the inside might save lives." Severus snapped his gaze back to Dumbledore. "You want a spy? You want me to be a spy? In the war that is coming? I think we will need one. We are going in blind and things are only getting darker. I want to fight, said Severus, and it was still quiet. I want to stand up for things, for once. This is the fight, said Dumbledore. I know what I'm asking, Severus. I know the sacrifices I am asking. But we need you. In the warmth of the pub, Lily was talking with her hands. This was a problem for the mug of butterbeer she was holding, which was spilling on her shoes. Someone has to, Severus said, the words feeling dull on his tongue, and I won't look out of place there. He stopped coming to the Hog's Head. Dumbledore told him to tell no one, but he told Lily. When he and Lily met up now, it was out at Hagrid's after dark, or snuck into the kitchens to visit the house elves after hours. When the stained glass peach giggled, Lily liked to giggle right back, even in those days. They toasted each other with hot chocolate that never got lukewarm, and they didn't talk about the war. At meals, Severus sat with Avery and Mulciber. He drifted through their conversations, picking at his potatoes, answering their words seconds and minutes too late. I thought that Evans had you wrapped around her little mudblood finger, said Avery. Severus scraped the tines of his fork across his plate. Seen her mooning around Potter lately, he said. Avery had already continued on into discussion about holiday plans by the time he said it, but they were used to their housemates' lags by now. Found a pretty rich boy and dropped me to the curb. In classes he sat with Narcissa. He could pretend to hate Lily. He could conjure up his mother's bitter rhetoric on his tongue, but he'd prefer not to tank his studies, and Narcissa at least would see his precise notes as not goodness, but ambition. When Mulciber said hateful things in the Slytherin common room, Avery sniggering, Regulus squeaking in wide-eyed amusement, Severus didn't stand. He didn't snap out anything. He didn't laugh either. He smiled, a cold little thing he'd practiced in the mirror again and again, just the thinning of lips and the lift of a brow. Here comes the graduate, said his mother as Severus pushed through the front gate, his bag slung over his shoulder. You'd think he was coming home from the wars, Eileen. But his father came down from the front step to clap Severus's shoulder and try to take his bag. Severus's hand tightened on the strap. Actually, I need that, he said. I'm not staying long. This is the end of part 1 of 6. This has been a reading of a fanfiction creation by E.Jade Lomax with music by Maiden.